and welcome to Dialogue. The world is still waiting for the Russian response to proposals made by Ukraine during peace talks in Turkey. So meanwhile, as Western opinions dominate the media, how does the global South, with many developing countries, view the ongoing crisis? How might they suffer from the consequences of the war and crushing sanctions? Their interests being taken care of when the West pressure the rest of the world to line up with them. With these questions in mind, I'm glad to be joined today by Hannah Ryder, founder and CEO of Development Reimagined, Professor Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chairman of Manipur Advanced Research Group, and Charles Tom, Chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show. I will start with Professor Nalapat. The latest what we have is like a Ukrainian side and Russian side seems to be making, visible, you can call it like a concessions probably. The Ukrainian side that we're not going to join NATO, but we need some security guarantees from like a big five from the UN Security Council and other countries. And the Russian side said, you can join. We will not stop you from joining the EU, European Union. At the same time, they are scaling down probably their military presence near the capital city of Kyiv and focusing on the eastern part of the Ukraine for military operation over there. So, Professor, do you see that as some visible progress or substantial even in terms of the negotiation between the two sides?
Well, I'd like to point out that, as has been pointed out very often in the past, the fact is that if Ukrainian government has said this in the beginning, that it's not interested in joining NATO, and if NATO had said it's not interested in having Ukraine as a member, this war could have been avoided. But the fact is, this Ukrainian government is desperate to join NATO, and NATO is very keen on co-opting the Ukrainians. Whether they do it as a full member or they do it, without, without a formal membership is a different matter. So after 1 month of this war, I think Moscow has got a very clear idea about the views of NATO towards Russia and the views of this Ukrainian government towards Russia. So from that point of view, I'm very doubtful that they are going to trust this present Ukrainian government and NATO to honor any promises made in a situation in which, frankly, the initiative is with the Russian side, where the military is concerned. So from that point of view, these assurances will be taken with more than a pinch of salt.
Charles, from Brazil, you're based in Brazil, so I wonder, how do you see this ongoing crisis? Professor Nalapat mentioned about NATO eastward expansion. Do you also see that as part of the problem?
Absolutely. In fact, Professor Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago goes further than that. He actually blames the West and United States for provoking Russia by admitting all the ex-Soviet republics into NATO to confront Russia. And unfortunately, the whole war, like Professor said, could have been avoided if Ukraine did not want to so desperately join NATO and put it into their constitution. Russia would not feel, let's say, so cornered. And I think that unfortunately now they're going to go back to this situation of being a neutral country with half of the country destroyed. And it was totally unnecessary to have so much suffering, so much destruction, and 4 million people leave as refugees.
It's definitely a tragedy. So Hannah, you are in Africa, in Kenya here, recently, yesterday actually, Tuesday, Chinese foreign ministers speaking to the EU chief foreign policy maker, the foreign policy chief, Borrell, saying that Wang Yi stressed very much about not choosing sides between Russia, Ukraine, between Russia and the West. His point is that by choosing side, you are setting different camps against each other. You're not solving the problem. So you need to focus on dialogue and negotiation. From your point of view, from African point of view, I know basically the global South has chosen to stay neutral despite their opposition to war. The majority of them definitely is against the war. So how do you make of that, not choosing side, to stay neutral?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very nuanced position, I would say, that many countries have taken, including my own Kenya. But there's a spectrum of different perspectives on this. And I think only some of them can necessarily be described as neutral, but certainly some can, but others are also described in different ways. So I would say that one of the key points here is many countries in the global South are part of a movement called the non-aligned movement. And the point of the non-aligned movement is not to say that sovereignty is okay, that it's okay to have war and that it's okay for sovereignty to be infringed. Absolutely not. But what the point of the non-aligned movement and the principles within the non-aligned movement are really focused on finding ways to make sure that in trying to solve crises such as what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, that you use methods which also do not infringe on sovereignty and that you do not create further challenges and further damage as you do so. So there's other certain types of principles like non-interference, for instance, which then would lead you towards, for instance, using much more, trying to focus more on dialogue between the two parties, finding neutral parties to be able to help them to come to agreement and to find ways to satisfy both sides. It's not necessarily that countries do not think war is a bad thing and that what Russia has done is a bad thing. They do think it's a bad thing. It's just that in terms of finding the solution, they think it's not necessarily going down routes like sanctions and so on, or other types of activities which would also continue to infringe international law.
Well, thank you, Hannah. You mentioned the sanction, which is the topic I'm going to touch upon. Professor Nalapat, you have, I expect you guys have the views about the war, not exactly the same with, with the views held by most of the Western countries or the international community, they say. So, about the sanctions, ensuing sanctions, crushing sanctions on Russia, and also it impacted the rest of the world too, the global South. So also remember the sanctions, they are not from the United Nations. They are from US, they are from European countries. So how do you make of that? Unilateral sanctions should, like the rest of the world, follow the sanctions, following their steps and impose sanctions on Russia, like in particular big countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, China.
Well, India will definitely not follow these sanctions because one good thing about the West, they have made very clear, President of the United States has made very clear, he wants Putin out in one form or the other. The European Union and NATO have made it very clear, they want to destroy the Russian economy. This was made clear in the first 2 or 3 days of the war. The purpose of sanctions was to destroy the Russian economy and essentially drive the Russian people onto the streets and deprive them of livelihoods, deprive them of incomes, deprive them of medicine, drive them into the streets in sheer desperation. I'm sorry, but Russians have been close to Indians for more than 70 years, and frankly, Russia is the country that beat back Hitler on the ground in the last century. So, I mean, they're very clear. It's not so much Putin, it's Russia, the Russian economy. And they want to destroy the Russian economy. They want to destroy Russian society. And I want to ask you, I mean, they've declared these war aims over and over and over again, including the EU chief, including the chief of foreign policy of the EU, including the top leaders of the European Union and the United States. Now, what kind of a policy is this? That you seek the destruction of the livelihoods, the lives of an entire people. You seek the meltdown of a country. If anyone thinks that's a reasonable objective, I'm sorry. at least in India, we regard it as hugely unreasonable.
Well, Charles, what does Brazil see the sanctions, or to a large extent, what about the Latin American countries, the community's response to the sanctions? Do they support the sanctions? Do they have any plan to follow their steps and impose their own sanctions on Russia?
Well, as the Brazilian president who visited Putin just a few weeks before the war started, Brazil has condemned the war, and everybody condemns violence and death and destruction. But Brazil, the president of Brazil made it very clear that Brazil is neutral. Brazil depends, Brazil does not want to be enemies of Russia or the West. Brazil depends on all the countries, and it depends very much on the fertilizers from Russia, and depends very much on the wheat from Ukraine, and for example, urea and potash. Brazil's such a big agricultural country, it needs these products from Russia and from Ukraine. Brazil has good relations with all the countries.
Well, Hannah, what about the African countries? I know more than a dozen of them basically said no or gave abstained from the vote in the UN resolution condemning the Russians. So what do people's justification or say argument against the sanctions or for the sanctions?
Yes, so there was in the initial UN General Assembly vote, we saw African countries effectively split down the middle, with 49% of African countries either abstaining or voting no, or not even being in the room to vote, and then the other 51% voting for some kind of action to support Ukraine. Now, whether that extends to sanctions is not. Sanctions are not already agreed by the UN, so the sanctions are not a UN measure, as one of our colleagues already pointed out, and a vast majority of African countries, I believe, would be certainly continue to be against sanctions and are generally against sanctions within the UN in all sorts of different situations. Zimbabwe has been the subject of sanctions, and there's considerable support across the African continent for removal of those, for instance. So these are not measures that African countries would necessarily support. However, they do support UN processes. They do support dialogue and pressure in some sense, but through legitimate means, through the UN, and of course, where there is the possibility of intervention by other countries to help support that dialogue, for example, by China or by South Africa. We've seen South Africa being fairly proactive. African countries will support that.
Well, Hannah, for the global South, one thing visibly different from the rich world or from the Western world is they have this decades or hundreds of years of suffering from this colonialism or imperialism, and they see wars usually taking place on their land. For example, in recent years, we see Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, etc. So Yemen, for example. So is that the reason they see the world different from the West?
Well, I think what many African countries would have liked to see is the same degree of horror and upset by the international community in its entirety with regards to these other types of other problems and other wars. We only need to look at Libya as one example, and on the continent in particular. But there are also obviously many other regional conflicts and so on which need to be dealt with. I think the question is really about what kinds of steps can be taken now to resolve the crisis. And I think most African countries will want as quick resolution as possible. We want to be going back to normal trade patterns. And yes, many African countries also have significant relationships with Russia, not only as in terms of imports. A few have significant imports from Russia, but others also work with have aid relationships with Russia, etc. So back to normal would be great for
Yes.
most.
Professor Nalapat, many people, as far as I know, living in the global south, they often point finger at the US and the West in general, say, what about the illegal invasion of Iraq? Did any country ask China, India, or Brazil, or South Africa to impose sanctions on US, or or even do some investigation into possible war crimes over there? Is that the sense, strongly felt in the global south?
Well, I'd like to say that I was in Iraq and I saw for myself the horrible suffering of the Iraqi people, especially children, especially the poor, because of the sanctions imposed by the United States, the UK, and some other countries. It was extremely cruel. And at that time, you had Madeleine Albright basically doubling down on sanctions. And of course, those sanctions were not as severe as the sanctions that have been rolled out at rocket speed against Russia. Well, look, I mean, we have been told by our friends in Europe and the United States, Europeans not so loudly because they are buying Russian oil in huge quantities. The United States, because it would like to sell its oil, it's a different situation. But we have been told, stop buying Russian oil. I mean, what are you telling us? You're telling us a poor country, a country with 300 million poor people, you're telling that country to stop buying oil at a discounted rate from a tested friend and instead buy highly more expensive oil from the United States? So far as the Middle East is concerned, you have already blocked the Middle East from selling any more oil to the south. That oil has got to flow to Europe and to North America, or not North America, to Europe. So you block them from supplying. What are we supposed to do? Pay double for oil, triple for oil, or get discounted oil? The reality of the situation is that to expect India, for example, to forego the chance of buying much cheaper oil and gas, much cheaper and very essential inputs for fertilizer from Russia, it's a cruel punishment on the people of India. And I am very confident under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there is no question of India coming to this conclusion. I'm really shocked. I mean, America is a friend of India, the UK, the EU are friends of India. How can friends of India tell us to make hundreds of millions of Indian people suffer so that they can get vindicated? Oh, there are complete sanctions that they themselves are breaking. The Europeans are breaking the sanctions daily.
Yeah, but Professor,
I mean, daily they're breaking. The
Professor,
Japanese are breaking the sanctions daily. Why do you expect a poor country to keep them?
Yeah, do you mean that, when Washington, Brussels, when they were planning sanctions on Russia, they didn't take into consideration of the possible consequences, for the global south, like for India, for African countries, for China, for Latin American countries? Because this is going to affect their trade with Russia, their purchase, for example, wheat or oil and gas from Russia, and even because Russia is out of the SWIFT system, so it will be a lot of, more difficult probably to conduct the trade with Russia.
Yes, I'd like to say that I don't think so. We are going to use rupees for trade with Russia. And the Russians have made it very clear to the Europeans that they'll have to use rubles. So the ruble's value has come back almost to the value it was pre-invasion. You recall that the invasion, one of the objectives of the invasion, according to all these NATO members, was to destroy the ruble. And for some time, the ruble did show a decline in value. Guess what? It's come back to almost its original value. And that is the situation. They have failed. They failed to deter Russia. They have failed to bring down the price of the ruble. And they are failing to demoralize the Russian people. So why are you persisting with these cruel and unusual sanctions? I mean, you're supposed to be enlightened liberal countries. We go there and we are basically lectured in how you should be more enlightened, more liberal. I mean, looking at what we are seeing, is this enlightenment? Is this liberalism? that you want to go ahead and punish the people of a country and punish other people in even poorer countries for just daring to treat that country and its people as human beings.
So sanctions, they do have consequences, obviously. So Charles, Mexico complained about this slow move in Washington to approve the assistance to Central American countries in order to prevent the inflow of illegal immigrants or refugee, whatever you define it. But when they see the quick move in Washington, like in 1 week's time, they provided $1 billion worth of military and economic aid to Ukraine. And also the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they provided assistance to Ukraine in a very quick fashion, very different from previous dealing with other developing countries. So is that the sense of injustice, the sense of unfair or unequal treatment that is being probably widespread in the global South?
It strikes me the difference of the treatment for refugees from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and other countries. So although the United States illegally invaded Iraq, the treatment of receiving refugees from all the countries is very, very different than from a white Christian country like Ukraine. So many countries have accused the West because of the racism or the preferential treatment for the white Christians rather than the Arab and other nationalities and races.
Yeah, speak of that, Hannah, there are several instances. Indian students, students from African countries were mistreated, obviously, during their endeavor to leave that country when the war started over there. And of course, there are media reports in the Western media outlets saying publicly that this Ukraine is different from like Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively European, relatively civilized. They are with blue eyes, and blonde hair. This is a blatant racism and double standard, to say the least. So, what's the response for people like living in Africa?
Well, certainly it has. If there's one word I think runs through all of these discussions, it's inconsistency. Inconsistency in terms of the response to the war versus other wars. Inconsistency with regards to support for different refugees from around the world, and generally inconsistency with regards to policy when it is important domestically and when it isn't important to others, etc. So I think there is a general theme that runs through, and I think many African people, governments have been perhaps not surprised, but definitely it's not surprised. I think concerned that this is revealing itself. But as I said, the most important thing now is really to try to find a way through, and to use what has happened to then say, well, if this happens again somewhere else, if it happens again in Iraq, if it happens somewhere on the African continent, then these are the kinds of things that we expect to happen and to be done. We expect doors to be opened as quickly as they can. So this needs to be used as precedent.
Yes.
We can't necessarily correct for the past, but we can correct for the future, definitely.
Yeah, well said. Professor Nalapat, if I believe you do, if you pay close attention to the international media, mostly, let's say, Western media, the mainstream media, they use this phrase, international community. Frequently appears in their, either from the Western officials or in the Western media over there. They're blaming Russia, urging countries like China, India to pick a side. How do you define the term? People are puzzled sometimes. If you take a close look, international community usually refer to European countries, the United States, or plus probably Japan, Asia. And then the rest of the world somehow is being forgotten or is like non-existent. What do you make of that?
Well, the international community are the members of NATO, and everybody else belongs to a separate planet. You know, you'll be surprised. The Washington Post ran a front page story very disapprovingly on how Russia has been helping India get its students out of Ukraine. And it is a fact that President Putin helped the Prime Minister Modi to ensure that every single Indian student was able to leave Ukraine, and all the South Asian students, who wanted to leave, were also enabled through India because of help from President Putin. And the Washington Post was very unhappy about that. They said in the front page, what is this? Russia actually helping Indian students to leave. Does the Post want Indian students to have gone there and been bombed and to die? I don't know. The New York Times, a few days ago, there was supposed to be a strike in India. This is a complete non-event. There is no strike almost anywhere except in a communist-ruled state called Kerala, and in a state where communists are powerful, parts of it, called Bengal. In the rest of the country, life was normal. According to the New York Times front page, the whole of India was paralyzed by this strike. So it beats me. Why is the Western media so horribly opposed to the South? I just can't understand it. Why are they back to the era of John Foster Dulles, of us and them? I mean, I don't call them racist. I mean, many of them are good friends of mine, including journalists in these important newspapers, but they're not racist. But why are they going back to this kind of talk? Why are they talking nonsense about India? New York Times has become an object of ridicule in India. Washington Post has become an object of fun in India for attacking Prime Minister Modi and President Putin to jointly get Indian students out of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And secondly, each time some reference is made to India, oh, it's a hateful country, there's genocide, there's mass murder. Good Lord, I travel across India. Where is all this genocide? Where is this mass murder? I would like to end this by saying Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, funded several groups to come to India, several NGOs to dig for mass graves. And finally, there were a lot of bones found, and there was great excitement. Those bones were buffalo bones, and I'm sure Hillary Clinton was very disappointed. This is the colonialist, Orientalist view of India.
History matters. So Hannah, let's focus a little bit in less than 1 minute for you probably here, because you are in the business community. So how are you going to continue to do business if you have business with the Russian partners, partners in Russia? Or how do you think countries like Kenya and South Africa and Egypt, which relies on the wheat import from Russia, how are they going to cope with these challenges, difficulties?
So let me be clear, my business does not have, we do not have Russian clients. However, we are agnostic towards different clients and where they come from. And I think that's important. I think majority of African business people, those in the global South, India, Brazil, etc., are agnostic and are willing to try to make the right kinds of business with others. I think the challenge is going to be absolutely, there's certain countries who do trade a lot with Russia and Ukraine, Egypt in particular, as we were talking about, for agricultural products, but the vast majority do not. Even just if you look at agricultural imports, only 3% of agricultural imports from Africa come from Russia and Ukraine. So it's not a huge issue, but of course, what we need to be doing is also what this crisis has demonstrated, and also the sanctions have demonstrated, is the importance of building our own self-sufficiency.
Yes, but they also suffer a problem from the rising fuel prices or food prices, despite the lack of direct contact with that.
So Egypt is in a good position.
Sorry, we have to stop there, Hannah. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.